Sometimes the photographer wants to freeze a subject in motion. The photographer wants a perfect and sharp rendition of the subject and also its context. Freezing the motion of a subject in a context requires a relatively fast shutter speed. If the shutter speed is too slow, the image will show blur that results from motion. If the goal is to stop action, that is, not to have motion blur, then you need to shoot at a relatively fast speed, often 1/400th of a second or higher. How fast depends on your subject and its context. At that speed, if light is low or if you want a broad depth of field, you might find that everything is underexposed. Under these circumstances, you have to raise the ISO to get room to maneuver. There are several factors that affect stop-action shutter speed. The three main factors to consider when trying to create a photograph that stops action or freezes movement are the relative speed and direction of the moving subject, the distance between you and the subject, and finally, the focal length of the lens. The most important factor in freezing motion is choosing a fast enough shutter speed. How fast the subject is moving and in which direction in relation to you are also extremely important factors. Someone waving a hand might be frozen with the speed of 1/100th of a second, but water dripping from a faucet might require 1/500th to 1/2000th of a second. The direction of the moving subject is important too. A subject moving toward you or away from you can be frozen in motion with slightly slower shutter speed than a subject moving from side to side. Another factor to consider is the distance between you and the moving subject. If you're shooting a moving subject close to you, it takes up more of the frame and gets more emphasis, and the range of motion is larger. So when the moving subject is close, you need to set the shutter speed higher than you would if it was further away. The focal length of the lens is also another important factor connected to determining the necessary shutter speed to freeze motion. Again, it relates to how much of the frame the moving subject is occupying. The image in a telephoto lens seems closer, takes more space in the frame. You'll need a faster shutter speed to freeze motion of a moving subject in a telephoto lens than you would shooting the same subject with a wide-angle lens. Your camera's autofocus speed and its ability to continually focus, autofocus, determine whether you will successfully freeze your subject in focus. Canon and Nikon DSLR cameras are generally quite good in locking focus on the moving subject and tracking the subject as it moves through space. Mirrorless cameras are equally adept with DSLR for still and slow-moving subjects, but for fast-moving subjects, action sports, racing, falling objects, mirrorless cameras still lag somewhat behind DSLR cameras. Another problem that can intervene in attempts to create freeze in motion is called shutter lag. Shutter lag is the time delay between when you hit the shutter and when the sensor actually begins taking the photograph. Two factors contribute to a long delay or shutter lag: flipping the reflect mirror used for metering to get it out of the way of the sensor, and when the camera is trying to complete autofocus. If possible, pre-focusing on something that will be the same distance as the subject when it moves to that spot can prevent or reduce shutter lag. Finally, here's a chart for approximations of the shutter speed needed to freeze various kinds of motion. People walking generally will require a range between 1/125th of a second to 1/500th. People running require a range approximately from 1/500th to 1,000th of a second. Action sports can require a range from 1/500th to 1/2000th. Flying birds, 1,000th up. Moving cars in the street, 1,000th up to 1,500th. Auto racing, 2,000th and up. For other kinds of moving subjects, the best thing to do is experiment. Camera blur, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Using slow and even sometimes extremely slow shutter speeds allows you to create distinctive photographs with a distinctive and expressive visual character. Whether simply suggesting motion using minimal amounts of motion blur, or creating abstract and even surreal otherworldly images using maximal amounts of blur, the use of slow shutter speeds to create blur adds another dimension to the expressive power of your photographs. Speed and direction of the moving subject, again, play a major role. The faster the subject is moving, the more blur is created. A subject moving side to side shows more blur than one moving toward or away from the camera. Some subjects might only require a 5-second exposure. Others might require 30 seconds, even a minute. The distance between you and the subject, again, affects the amount of blur. The closer, the more blur you get. The further away, the less. The focal length of the lens plays an important role. Shooting with a longer focal length lens will create more blur than a shorter focal length. The subject is moving through a larger portion of the frame. Trial and error is always a good option. Shoot and review and adjust and shoot again. Tripods help minimize camera shake. If you have no tripod, place the camera on a stationary object, a wall or a table. Neutral density filters can also be helpful by reducing the light coming in and allowing you to use higher f-stops. Showing the subject in motion, suggested by the blur, is possible with slow shutter speeds. Careful choice can mix blur with precision in highly effective ways. Another strategy involves looking for ways to capture stationary people or objects in a moving environment in which the things that are moving are blurred and the stationary objects are not. Light trails, light pulls, light in a very slow exposure can become amazing light abstracts. Cars and trucks, neon lights, almost any kind of light source can become a source of fascination. Most often, these works need a tripod, but sometimes, if you use a smooth movement, choreographing the movement works amazingly well with the pattern of the lights. Misty waterfalls, rivers, and flowing bodies of water are a subject of endless fascination. The interplay between water and light provides many chances to explore the rich consequences of slow shutter technique. Finally, there's a technique called panning, which is borrowed from cinema photography, and it's also most effective with a tripod. Some forms involve complex patterns of movement of the camera created by pulling the tripod back and forth in various kinds of rhythmic patterns.